The way people just behaved around even the interns was astonishing. I would hear like very like inappropriate comments at times.
Most people align fundamentally like 95% of their values. There's usually just one stupid thing or concept that they have related to an issue that's just keeping them completely on the other side. When I talk to conservatives about should kids be allowed to have puberty blockers, you know, the framing of that is always like these crazy malicious psychiatrists that are coming from gender theory schools to feed, you know, puberty blockers to turn your children into February, like whatever crazy stuff they have.
For social media people, what do you think is going to be the role of social media going forward in national legislative efforts?
I suppose informing people in one sense. I mean, especially if we're talking about like LGBT rights. I mean, in the UK, for example, our press is just like hardline anti-trans. And so it only publishes like anti-trans stuff. So if anything positive happens, they just don't publish it. And people just don't know about it at all. And I know lots of people who follow me and similar UK trans accounts say, like, I only knew about this court case because you were talking about it, or I only know what this even means because you're talking about it. So I guess that's quite important, because if you don't know what's going on, you can't really do anything about it, can you?
That's right. And also, by the way, I'm abridging this because originally I was planning for a 2-hour panel, but we have to bring it to 1 hour. So when people begin speaking, if you could please introduce yourselves, by the way.
Oh, sorry.
I send out everyone's bios and short descriptions on social media, but just in the name of timeliness.
Okay, I'm Katie Montgomery. Hi, I argue on the internet.
I guess I will go next. So I'm Josie Rose Caballero. I am the project manager for the National Center for Transgender Equality, running the U.S. Transgender Survey, and I also stream on Twitch, Josie Rose C. And one of the things that came to mind when I heard the social media thing, as a researcher, it's very important for us to make sure that we have the people who are the respondents for quantitative data, and we use social media to get out the word and get it out to communities that are hard to reach, like the trans community. A lot of us live online. So it's important for us to know how to connect with people and connect to people with social media so we can make sure that those stories are captured in the quantitative data analysis that we need. So, and also getting out that information once we get those respondents as well. But social media is probably one of the largest tools that we have as researchers for the trans community to collect that data. So.
Hi, my name is Dylan Burns. Currently, I am a political consultant with 21st Century Democrats Political PAC, and I was just reappointed on the environmental board in the city of College Park. I think that when it comes to social media use, there's two main uses, I think. Number one is disseminating information. Before, when you wanted to get the word out about LGBTQ plus activism, it was a lot of kind of backroom kind of, you had to do it through, say, magazines, or you had to do it through like clubs and hotspots for like gay activity, LGBTQ plus activity. But social media gives us a better way to reach people directly and inform them about events. Recently, I was with PG Changemakers and PG Pride, and we were doing a vaccine event and handing out toiletries completely free of service. It was a good way to kind of give like a good image to see how LGBTQ plus people are directly assisting people during COVID. And a lot of people who showed up only found out about it through social media. And so while I think mailers are still important, I think magazines and the traditional ways are still important. It gives us another avenue to reach people and get them connected to resources, whether that be physical resources or like just in contact with representatives. And another thing I would say is fundraising, that while I don't think that when it comes to social media use, it's really particularly helpful in turning people over to your side when it comes to voting in particular, I think it's good for getting your supporters and reminding them the importance of like donating to your political PAC or donating to your cause, and kind of getting the hook, line, and sinker approach to getting their dollar into the organization of for example, Free State and other organizations like that. So I think those are the two main uses for social media. Definitely when it comes to LGBTQ plus activism in particular.
Yeah, my name is Stephen Bonnell. My online.
We can't hear you.
No, of course not. Well, who said I was talking to you? It's pretty presumptuous. No, I'm just kidding. Hey, my name is Stephen Bonnell. My online moniker is Destiny. I agree largely with what's already been said. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of agreement here. It seems like the most important thing in terms of like online spaces and LGBT people are the two sides of the same coin. You've got the dissemination of information, so getting updates related to health or care available or news stories out, and then also just the opportunity to find and join communities in an easier way that sometimes can be more challenging in real life, especially depending upon where you live.
All right, thank you. And now to kind of piggyback off of that subject, a question to our legislative advocates. So the COVID-19 pandemic has affected all of our lives and all of our careers. I want to ask you all, with your work experience, especially recently, how did you primarily engage in legislative advocacy before the pandemic, and how did that change after it started? And anyone can go in any order.
Sure, I'll go ahead and start. I'm Grayson. Before the pandemic, I was actually working on Capitol Hill for Texas 29, Sylvia Garcia, on the impeachment trial as well as the census. And currently I work with like servers, bartenders, hospitality professionals to help them create relationships with their local and state elected officials so that they can have a voice at the table when decisions are being made. I think this is a great question for me anyway, because that's kind of how I am now finding myself through social media. Capitol Hill, when the pandemic happened, a lot of us on Capitol Hill that were just beginning our careers kind of lost our jobs, and we're left to kind of find a new way to stay involved and, you know, restart our careers. And that involved learning a lot of social media and how people put that information out there. I think an interesting point, tying back to the question before, is that there's some tools that I've learned that social media has that we can't take advantage of. For example, like in Congress, we have particular rules and things that we have to go by, franking laws and things like that, as far as what mail we can send out, when, who we can contact, how many people we can contact, and things like that. And those are rules that people through social media aren't really beholden to. And so I think that if we're smart, we will be starting to look to how we can utilize those types of things to get that information that everybody's already touched on out there. And how do we turn that information to actual action and not just like, hey, here it is, but what are we doing with it? What's important?
I think for a lot of largely online people like myself, I don't think we had to change too much in terms of how we did advocacy before and after. I know in the real world, the way that advocacy and outreach happened changed significantly, especially during the election season. Do you go to people's houses? Do you wear masks? A lot of the in-person advocacy was tuned down a lot for fear of the pandemic. But I think online, we already, for those of us that existed in the space prior to this, we already kind of had all the tools for communication, and we already kind of knew how to operate in this environment. And I think the pandemic just kind of gave more power to some of those voices online. That's what it felt like. So if you were positioned to take advantage of it, I think you did pretty well, both like in a monetary sense for viewers growing, and then kind of in an outreach sense in terms of platform growth and people kind of hearing your message.
That makes sense. Representative Dylan, you're going to say something?
Yeah. Well, before the pandemic, I was outreaching to a lot of people through Twitter. That's my primary thing. By the way, I'm Representative Tone, she, her, House District 27 in Colorado, first trans person to be elected here in Colorado. And it was always really cool to interact with people online before, giving them relevant information. It's always like timely stuff. That's what's really important. And the pandemic really had so much information that came out, and we had to make sure people knew what the latest facts were, where to go find things, how to get testing, where to go if you felt sick, and then how to get a vaccine, and then how to get unemployment insurance. We had so many people who had to have unemployment claims. So making sure that people knew that I was actually helping people with that was super important, because people were going literally broke because they weren't working and they needed help. And they didn't know that they could actually reach out to me to help. And even if I wasn't their representative, I would still help them anyway, because I don't want to see them lose their house or lose their jobs or anything else that they might have because they didn't have an income coming in. So we really used social media and even email to some extent to make sure that we were reaching out with every latest update that was out there, because there was so much information in it. And I felt that I was a trusted source that people could count on. And I think that a lot of people view people that they follow on social media when they have a good reputation, that they are trustworthy. And that's really important because there's a lot of bad information out there and you have to sort through it.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Jeremy, I see that, so we don't have you on camera, but I see that you have your hand up. Do you have any thoughts on the subject?
Yes, I do. Thank you. Hello, and thank you, Riley, for putting this together. My name is Jeremy Lemaster. Pronouns are he and they. I'm the executive director for Free State Justice, formerly known as Equality Maryland. We do policy advocacy at the state level and provide direct client legal services for low-income LGBTQ folks. And so, I kind of have two kind of quick thoughts. The one really just on how the original question sort of on how legislation strategy has sort of changed for us in our state with the sort of pandemic. I think every state legislature is different, and the ways, and even within your legislatures, each individual committee may or may not have adapted to technology differently during COVID. But I know pre-COVID, the majority of our work was done sort of in Annapolis, like in the rooms, of our General Assembly, of attending these hearings, providing testimony, and kind of sitting in on voting sessions, just to kind of be a person in the room to kind of, more or less monitor, our representatives and ensure that they are, not sneaking in any sort of poison pill amendments, or that, they're not trying to kind of mess up, elements of the legislation we're trying to run. One thing that I noticed this session, when we started moving towards virtual environments, all of these things had to be, streamed on YouTube, and that allowed for a whole new audience that previously wasn't able to be in the room in Annapolis to be able to kind of just tune in and sort of be there present and watch. And I know for us, it was actually really helpful for some of our policies because, in our state, even though we're a super majority Democratic state, a lot of our Democrats still are very conservative in a number of ways when it comes to LGBTQ issues. And we had some of our committees where these conservative Democrats were really, who kind of pretend to be or proclaim that they're LGBTQ allies, were very much intentionally sort of messing up some of our legislation. And it was great to kind of have a sort of a record of that and to have an audience for that. And, I don't think these legislators realized that they were being watched. I think they gotten so used to only having like a handful of folks in a room, as they're kind of in committees debating. And so when we had this new audience, we had sort of these viral clips to be able to kind of rapidly deploy, send out, and to kind of really activate folks to really respond and kind of hold them accountable. And so I'm kind of excited to see what this is going to mean next session. I imagine that there's going to be a concerted effort to try to roll back this sort of increased, access and transparency to the process, and more of a re-emphasis on the kind of in-person, closed-door kind of style of policy making that they were used to. But I know that's on everyone's mind of, ensuring now that we've sort of, opened this door, not to having it closed again. And so I'm kind of excited to see how the, COVID plus social media has sort of even just changed the ways in which the legislative process is done, on the state level, because we don't really necessarily have like, C-SPAN or things like that.
That's actually really interesting. Or sorry, go ahead.
Can I ask a question about that? I'm actually really interested. On YouTube, there was a channel, I don't remember the lawyer, but there was like a channel that blew up. And it was like, I think anybody could either join publicly, like this Zoom for a courtroom, or all of the court proceedings were uploaded onto YouTube. And it was funny because, a lot of people enjoyed watching, a lot of people laughed at some of the cases, a lot of people had input to give. And I think that ultimately by the end of that, this was like as you brought up, it's kind of like a new world. Like nobody's had that level of transparency before for some of these like local proceedings. I'm talking about a courtroom now, but you're talking about, like public meetings. Do you think that something like that going forward is a positive experience? Do you think that there are any negatives related to that? And ultimately, how do you feel like the legislators on both sides felt about that like ultra transparent environment?
Yeah, I'll be honest that I think, one kind of issue I foresee, and I think in the same way that it is providing a platform for folks in terms of like, especially in like testimony, right, for hearings, is providing a greater platform for some folks. It's also providing that same platform for opposition, right? And so even in our state, again, where in Maryland, you know, we haven't seen, you know, these, you know, blatantly anti-trans youth sports bans or bathroom bills or you know, whatever, you know, we don't have those legislation pieces coming up, but we still have individual, you know, representatives in our state and, you know, opposition folks, constituents who are any bill we're running, doesn't even matter what the bill is, they're kind of just using it as a chance to you know, express their opposition to the community writ large, right? And so it's kind of that, you know, that double-edged sword piece of, you know, yes, we get increased, you know, platforming, but so does hate to some extent, and so that's kind of to that piece. For the legislators piece, you know, I'll just be frank that I think most folks, especially ones that I've noticed are kind of more career politicians, are very much prefer to kind of do their deal making behind closed doors, right? And I think we even saw where a lot of they kind of started to learn quickly. You know, you would kind of see how committee chairs, you know, there's a lot more control over when mics were on and off, for example. And so there's a lot of times they would just, you know, in committee hearings, they know they're being broadcast on YouTube. They'd cut the mics and just whisper or talk to each other and then put the mics back on. And so there was this kind of like, they even had already started kind of censoring themselves in that way. And so and if our leadership, like the committee leadership and stuff is doing that, I can only and this is, you know, folks that are supposed to be our allies. You know, I can only imagine that is, I think, going to be indicative of them trying to kind of still be in control of what they're presenting and what's kind of getting shown.
When I had my short stint in the Maryland General Assembly, not elected, but as like just getting coffee for people, the way people behaved, this was right before, this was when Senator Mike Miller was still there. And this was the Senate president, if anybody didn't know. And it was right before we started getting like larger amounts of transparency due to COVID and more people wanting to be able to watch this stuff from home. And the way people just behaved around even the interns was astonishing. I would hear like very like inappropriate comments at times about different minority groups. I remember once hearing like, this was during the time when a lot more women were running for office, and I was getting coffee for the like more conservative side of the aisle, and just hearing them like openly laugh at the idea of more women running. Like I thought a woman was gonna, like, I remember one comment, like something like one person saying, I thought a woman was going to run against me this year. Crazy they're doing that these days. And like later just hearing like certain disparaging comments about Prince George's County and that type of stuff. It's hard for me to imagine that in the time of 1 to 2 years, that behavior has stopped, but it's going to be the more like, oh, we'll wait till after session to say this, or, oh, let's turn off the mic quick. Even in streaming and online stuff, you'll see like, hey, 1 second, let me mute. And then you'll just mute quick and you'll do the same thing. This exists in most places where stuff is live streamed. So I don't think it's going to mean like a complete change of culture, but it probably would mean that we're going to catch slip-ups a lot more on footage, and it would be easier to hold people accountable.
So something I'm nervous about for these things is when in like legal world and law terms, there are words that mean something very specific, and then in colloquial use, they mean something completely different, or, you know, with slightly different meaning. And if you're watching all these like live stream legal stuff, it could be very easy to misinterpret or even willfully misinterpret some of the stuff they're saying, and, you know, instantly blow it up to a huge platform before any experts or journalists have got to cut in and then like set the narrative very fast. And I know like the anti-trans people are doing that whenever they get to go and live tweet a, you know, a court case or something. They're always spinning the most ridiculous narrative that the newspapers will just publish before they've even read like the judgment or anything. So I guess there's something to be nervous about with that too.
Yeah, it's not even the most ridiculous narrative sometimes that's the most harmful. I've noticed, I was working on the Fight for 15 in DC to remove the tip minimum, and we were actually successful, but we had enough outside lobbyists come in and rally and tell bartenders and servers and hospitality professionals that like hey, if you remove the tip minimum wage, you're not going to make tips anymore, and you're going to make less money than you ever made. And this is going to be awful for you. Have you looked at what's happening in New York? Da, 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 da. And next thing you know, the city council actually rolled back what voters had wanted, right? Voters wanted, and it was just a simple messaging, right? It was a ton of social media and people coming out there, and it was simply saying, save our tips. That was it. And it had people who worked and made tips scared and showing up to tell city council, like, we don't want this. We don't want tips. We don't want, and I could see how that might also be used even in LGBTQ circles.
Arlie, I saw that you were going to speak earlier. Do you have any thoughts? You can speak on anything that we've been talking about.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Yes. My name is Arlie, they or she pronouns. And this is such an amazing panel of folks. There's so much good info. So just kind of building off some of what you all are saying, I think when we think about how our legislative advocacy work has changed in the past year, I think one of the big questions that everyone's getting at is, what are the good things that came out of this, right? Out of this sort of quarantine world that we've learned about legislative advocacy? And then what are the things that weren't so positive? And so thinking about, the fight against all of these anti-trans bills and how this legislative advocacy world has changed. In the before days, we really worked to get people excited by coming to in-person lobby days, right? Showing up at these hearings, meeting their legislative representatives, and really creating those relationships. Benefits, you're in person with people. You are actually learning about other folks and creating community. But drawbacks, it wasn't as accessible, right? So now when we look at this new kind of world we've created of attending hearings virtually and having virtual rallies and inviting our legislators to come talk to us online. There are a lot of benefits, and access is a huge one. Like we talked about, we can immediately be transported into the hearing room or into the courts when things are happening. We can ping our legislators online more easily. And so there's a lot there. But some of the drawbacks, in terms of social media are some of what you all have touched on too. These sound bites are incredible in terms of the ways we can say, look at what this legislator just said and did, and pass it around the internet. But it can work in harmful ways too, because we're not creating those more lasting relationships and those in-person kind of connections with people. So I think it's been a challenge all around on the legislative advocacy side. And I hope we've learned a lot from it and will continue to kind of change our ways and take the good stuff from this experience to improve the way we advocate for LGBTQ people.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. To kind of piggyback, so changing the subject a little bit, but kind of keeping with the theme, this is a question mainly for the social media people. So we talked a little bit earlier about some of the main uses for social media, mainly disseminating information and for fundraising. But each of you I also invited because it seems that you have a particular interest in advocating legislative efforts for LGBTQ plus people. So what have you found to be the most effective and least effective strategies for actually mobilizing people, mobilizing your followers and your base to take action? For example, like what platforms have you found to be the most effective? Like have things like hashtags or other kind of like small strategies on social media more effective or less effective? Like what have you found to be useful for actually getting people to go out and do things like canvassing or talking to their representatives or their legislators?
I think that when it comes to political advocacy, I think that different people fill different roles. And traditionally, I think it's really hard online to get people to do actual in-person advocacy because the audiences that we're connected to aren't restricted to a specific locale. So even for a federal initiative, there's going to be 50 different states in the US that you would have to get people to show up to events for, which can be really challenging. Or not even challenging. It's more like, I don't even know how you would know how well you're doing with any of that type of advocacy, because it's hard to track data, like how many, like, can I get a survey and how many of you showed up in this state and this state and this state and this state and this state? So it feels like if you're doing online stuff in general, it's going to be a lot harder to see the results of kind of that in-person advocacy. So obviously I did in-person canvassing events, which I thought was a lot of fun. But that type of stuff requires like a deliberate, concentrated effort. It requires a lot of time. It requires requires a lot of money. It requires a lot of organizing. Personally, for me to get people to show up and do stuff, I think it was two major things. One was just continually advocating for whatever particular thing you are advocating for. So for me, it was a mayoral race in my hometown, and then it was a Senate race. But then the other, probably more important thing was just showing up and being there, because people want like FaceTime with, whatever influencer, talent, artist, whoever they identify with, that's going to show up there and work as well.
When it comes,
sorry, go ahead.
You can go ahead. It's fine.
Okay. I think how to get people involved in things. One of the most useful things I found was where it's we need to fill in this government submission by this date, or we need to write a letter or something, and that can seem very intimidating, and people don't, they're very keen to help, but they don't know how to do it or what to do. And I've done a couple of live streams where I've just sat down and opened the form up and just talked people through it, really super simple, step by step. This is what I'm writing here. Here's some other things I could consider. This is why I'm not writing this thing. And then just be like, look, that took, half an hour or whatever. And I think that's made a big difference, because, so many people want to help and just don't know where to start.
I've tried to organize events before using the internet, particularly on the city council level. And the biggest issue I always ran into is when you just make a post, you can just hope people show up, but you never really know if someone's going to show up if you just make a post. It's so important to have that one-on-one communication with people. The best way to get somebody on Twitter, Facebook, or on any platform really to go to the event is to move it from, say, a tweet or a Facebook post to DMs, to private messages where hey, I saw you like this post. Here's more information I can give you. Here's some the actual date and time. Or maybe you can be guilt them a little bit, hey, I actually got the supplies already ready for you. I'm super excited for you to come up. Do your best, whatever you can in that private communication to be we want you here and we value your participation. Because all the events that I ended up organizing on the city council level, when it came to the amount of people who showed up who I didn't directly talk to, it's always 2 or 3. 80% of the people who show up are the people you directly talk to in private messages or in person. And so when it comes to making social media posts without any direct contact follow-up, it's casting a very wide net with very loose knots where people can easily just pass straight through it. You need to have that direct one-on-one communication, either in DMs, through a phone call or something after they interact with the post in some manner.
Real quick on that, I really want to pick up on something that Katie said. I think it was Katie that just said it. When we were doing our canvassing events, we were trying to kind of iterate from one event to the next to figure out okay, well, what do we need to do? We've got so much interest online, but not many people will show up, right? You might get 500 responses on a survey. You might get 20 people that actually show up in person. I think that Katie said something that is unbelievably true, which is that everybody or a lot of people want to help and they want to do something, but they don't always know how. And I notice that sometimes when watching, go campaign for Bernie or go campaign for, a particular candidate. And it's okay, yeah, okay. Sometimes you'll get sent to a website, sometimes you'll text somebody, but a lot of these are cold and they're kind of scary, and you'll lose 99% of the interest because people just don't know what to do. And I found that one of the most important things for getting people to canvas was I need to make the process of you sitting in front of your computer to being in front of a potential voter's door as streamlined and as easy as possible. So if that means fill out the form, here's your hotel room, we can set up carpools, whatever dumb logistic thing you can take care of, or whatever dumb knowledge hurdle you can get over. And it might be something as simple as filling out a form on a live stream, or it might be something as simple as showing somebody or talking somebody through a process. I think that especially online, we take for granted how easily people are discouraged from participating in certain things. The rest of the world has figured this out too, because in the real world, if you turn on any old person radio, and I listen to a lot of AM radio, you'll constantly hear commercials where it's are you receiving all of your Social Security benefits? You might not know. Call a lawyer; they'll help you figure it out. You've got people on Twitter today that are trying to walk people through hey, there's a new child tax credit. If you file a tax return, you can get money in advance. But a lot of people don't know this. When it came to signing up at the healthcare exchanges on the ACA, a lot of people don't know this, right? So all of this carries over into your real world advocacy too. Assume that people want to help, but you have to make it as easy as possible. And then what Dylan said afterwards, sometimes following up with confirmations of a commitment is also a big deal as well. For our canvassing things, we had people that were dedicated to just making a phone call and getting that verbal commitment. Oftentimes it's good because the people are reminded, and then if they make the verbal commitment, they feel a little bit more obliged to actually show up.
One thing on that I saw there was some UK law about trans rights that was going on, and the anti-trans side made this super easy form that you could just basically write your name on and click send. And they ended up getting 20,000 or something submissions, which looked really good in numbers for them. But because of the nature of it, it was, submitting evidence, they had 20,000 people had submitted evidence and it was all exactly the same. So I think streamlining is definitely important, but also in a way that people don't just click one thing and then just I've done my advocacy now, and then it'll just get ignored because it's the same as everyone else's.
Grayson, sorry.
Grayson, we can't hear you.
Sorry. To Katie's point, what Steven's talking about here is good. But the problem is, especially with things like these copy and paste emails, and the bots that we saw come about when Hillary was running and stuff like that in 2016. The problem there has been offices know how to sort through. They have the technology that can scan through and be like, oh, this is the same email copy and pasted. We'll just chuck all of this into the same email box and send out this copy and paste form. And people don't love receiving that, right? It doesn't make you feel like you really heard from your representative, because you're like, okay, yeah, somebody copy and pasted this. So I think that it is important to know that your representatives do need to respond to you, and to make it as easy as possible to streamline that process. But you do have to make sure that there is something unique about that reach out and what you're asking for or what you're saying, because it can very easily get lost if you're just doing it through something like, oh, I'm just going to copy and paste and send it to every senator and every congressperson across the country.
Yeah. Just to add on to that super quickly, and then I want to ask another question to move forward. But that's absolutely true. When I was working in Annapolis for a delegate this past session, whenever we would get a spam email, and it was pretty easy to tell when you get a spam email, right? It's just basically the exact same email with the same subject pattern or the same subject, and then just a different name over and over and over. We would be able to develop algorithms to just sort them all into folders, and then we would just make one copy paste reply all email to send all of them. The best ways, at least in Maryland, to be able to get in touch with your legislator is to call, set up an appointment, and to make sure that you always begin with saying, my name is so-and-so, and I am from this zip code, and making sure that you say that your zip code is in their district, right? They will almost always respond to people who are in their districts. If you don't start with that, then they're not going to really care that much about you. So just to put that out there, if you want to be able to get in touch with your representative, that's probably the best way to do so, which everyone should. All right. Now, the same question to our legislative advocates, but in the kind of the inverse. So now you've all heard the ways that people on social media, or who primarily use social media, try to mobilize their bases. What are the primary ways that you all mobilize your bases for legislative advocacy? And are there any lessons that, or are there any recommendations that you would make based on what you've heard to help people on social media better mobilize the people that they want to mobilize?
I can, Jeremy here, I can actually I was about to talk through that a little bit. So I think even before my current role at Free State, I did graduate studies in women's and gender studies and taught at Rutgers University in New Jersey. And I started teaching there, I think 2011. And in our, feminism, 101 courses, we had a dedicated content to what we called social media feminism, and feminist knowledge production in social media spaces. And we specifically, students would set up their own Tumblrs, because Tumblr circa 2010 to 13, I think, was its own little feminist knowledge production bubble to some extent. And really just demonstrating how social media can function as consciousness raising, right? So the same way we had consciousness raising groups for many different social movements, across space and time, social media can recreate those same environments. And I think for me, that is the challenge that I've been facing with in the legislative advocacy piece of, really before we can even get to a stage of a policy, right, and getting support for a policy, there's this kind of like education that needs to occur. And I think for me, case in point is really kind of, in Maryland, we were working with a coalition to decriminalize failure to obey a lawful order, just because it was, being shown to disproportionately being used against a number of different communities, including, trans folks and trans folks of color. And it more or less is an arbitrary way for folks to get sort of stopped and harassed or detained and booked. And in that process, we started kind of engaging with potential voters constituents and legislators. And we quickly realized that, in thinking about homeless folks or sex workers or things like that, that they don't even think of them as like people or as community members. And that we had to even kind of go 3 steps back to actually do concerted education around what it means to be homeless or in survival sex work or, in these different spaces, right? And so it was like we had to go 3 steps back and actually just focus on education on these base issues. And so to some extent, it's, I see it now, and now is like there's some value in the ways in which social media has sort of allowed for even like feminism, right? For like this kind of rapid diffusion of things like intersectionality or like the rapid diffusion of like gender neutral pronouns, right? And that I think like 20 years ago wasn't really a thing. But it kind of goes back to that same point of like, it is that double-edged sword, because now we are seeing, bans on critical race theory, and literally, people who are trying to ban critical race theory probably have no idea what critical race theory even is, if you ask them. And so, there's that kind of issue area education piece that is just this super important precursor before we can even do the kind of policy work. And I know, like in Maryland, for example, we're really long-term thinking about kind of the sex work decrim space. We're starting very, very local in Baltimore City. We're, doing some kind of surveying of the NIMBYs, the not in my backyard, types of folks, so like homeowners, small business owners, neighborhood associations, right, to identify the stigma, right, and then to create messaging and programming and education, right, that'll actually sort of counter that before we then even kind of talk about like an actual policy and what policies we would want to see for sex worker rights. And that's just happening on a local level, because we can't show up at the state house with anything looking like, sex work decrim at this point, because of just where the state is at in terms of its shared understanding of the issue.
Mm-hmm. Other legislative advocates, to go off the same question. So what have you found to be like the most effective means for mobilizing your constituents compared to like things that we've already talked about previously?
Can I go ahead? Sorry, I was gone, everybody. Thank you for giving me that space. I had to do another meeting. Very, very busy. Okay. So one thing, and I'm going to always bring back the research, because the research is very important. The U.S. Trans Survey is one of those pieces of data that we go and use with our legislative experts and policy advocates to ensure that they have the numbers to be able to combat the worst arguments. Because if you can go into a state house and say, hey, by the way, children are 9 times more likely to attempt and commit suicide than their cis peers, that's like hard evidence, right? And it's like, whoa, like now you completely change the context of saying like we're not advocating for children, right? And you have that information readily available. And I think it's very important as legislative advocates and as to have that data in your back pocket, because with that data, you're able to actually make sound arguments that aren't based on just your own feelings and emotions, but actually hard evidence and facts. And I'm telling you, when you bring out a statistic that say, hey, kids are dying, you will activate a lot of people to be able to fight for your cause, because I mean nobody wants children in their hands, right? So it's really important that we have that type of data, as well as just the discrimination piece, as well as how half of trans people don't seek medical help because they're afraid of discrimination or having to explain their own medical care to their doctor, right? Like just stats like that shows we're able to use that data. So yeah, I'm a quantitative data girl, so I'm going to keep bringing that up for this entire process.
And I kind of want to add to that real quick too, that, I think I definitely agree that data is extremely helpful, especially with folks that are kind of in our ally lane in terms of legislators, definitely into getting folks to be able to sponsor legislation or to vote our way on legislation. Where I've seen the data just not have any impact or effect is with folks that are not already kind of in that allied space. And so for me, there's this piece of like, I don't know how to, I don't have an answer to this, but it's like, when at the base, the values are not in alignment, like where at its core, folks don't think that sex workers have rights, right? And even if we show or demonstrate how horrible or terrible it is to sort of exist as a homeless person or, sex worker, et cetera, there's this like veneer that just kind of goes overhead is like, oh, well, that's a lifestyle choice and I don't care about the data. And so I'm just like, I don't know how to get to that values shift piece and I don't know if data works with everyone on that values piece. So, and that's just kind of an open question or thought that I had.
I don't think, or go ahead.
As the only legislator here, so I live this stuff every day, and you're right, Jeremy, that data goes so far in certain areas, but when it comes to trans rights, usually data doesn't matter. It's about, oh well, this is my religious belief, and screw the data. Who cares? It doesn't matter. And what I found, in a lot of cases, personal stories are really powerful, especially when it comes from people who are cisgender white guys who may be Christians, who are saying, that they accept their trans kid. Like, that's super powerful to say, hey, look, you know what? These are not all mutually exclusive things. You can be a Christian white heterosexual guy and still support trans people, and that goes a long way when it comes to the committee rooms and how legislators do end up feeling. But you can't just be one person. It has to be not one outlier, because it's like, well, it's just that one person. It needs to be more compelling. But when it comes to really getting people out there, sometimes you need to even go through like the little sliver of things that intersect. So when I ran my bill on the banning the gay and trans panic defense, we took it as like a criminal justice angle to it. And, Republicans love that stuff. They want to put criminals behind bars. They don't want people getting away with anything, right? So, my bill ended up passing with only one no vote in the entire General Assembly. And that's huge, because if there's anything that says like gay or trans in it, like, they freak out and they like run the other way. But we were able to frame it in a way that they can agree on. So sometimes that's ways you can move people, is through a slightly overlapping thing that occurs there that you can really accentuate, and it kind of drowns out like, oh, well, we're protecting gay and trans people, but it's about criminal justice. And you can kind of move people that way.
Find shared values. Like you share values with, every human on earth to
Exactly.
some type of value. And you can keep going back to like first principles and stuff and just being like, we both agree murder's wrong. So let's start there. And then, build up to the next bit, rather than trying to just start with trans kids that need healthcare.
So I'm hugely sympathetic to the data argument. I love data. I hate stories. I hate that people's minds are changed by stories, but it is absolutely the way that people process information in the real world. And I would actually amend some of the early statements. I don't think you have to find that sliver of values where you align. I think that most people align fundamentally, like 95% of their values. There's usually just one stupid thing or concept that they have related to an issue that's just keeping them completely on the other side of the fence. So like, as a personal anecdote, when I talk to conservatives when we talk about things like, should kids be allowed to have puberty blockers? The framing of that is always like these crazy malicious psychiatrists that are coming from gender theory schools to feed, puberty blockers to turn your children into femme, like whatever crazy stuff they have. Every single parent, every single parent has had some issue with their child, be it medical, be it behavioral, be it something. Every parent has had that experience of having an issue with their child, and there is so much stress and anxiety that goes into that. Is my kid normal? Did I do something wrong? is this particular thing that he has, is this going to mess up his life? Is that my fault? And I think that when you reframe, like I've done this a lot with the puberty blockers argument, when you reframe that, like that cold, detached, here are the stats, here are the, and it's more like a, hey, does your kid have ADHD? Or does he have some other type of behavior problem? Can you imagine if you're trying to figure out as a parent what the best like path forward is, and you're having a conversation with your doctor, and it's between you, the doctor, and your child? Could you imagine like some third party that has no stake whatsoever in the well-being of your child trying to insert themselves into that conversation? Like, it is the worst feeling in the world. And then you can always, I think that once you've established the narrative, you can always like hop back to the data, because the data is like a really good follow-up. You know, like, hey, you know, like 50% of children that have this thing do that, or this or that. But once you've really hooked into that personal story, it's really, really, really hard for somebody to come out and disagree with that shared value. Like, you know, actually, no, I do want more people involved in decisions that I make with my children between me, him, and the doctor. Like, I really do want it. Like, that's not going to be the case. So I do agree, like harping on those shared values and then kind of like building the framing up from there and then following up with data is like a really effective way, not to like completely change a person's mind initially, but at the very least, you'll get the ball rolling. So it'll be something for them to think about. And then you kind of plant the seeds of change, hopefully, going forward.
But to your point about stories, you may not like stories, but it's emotions. Emotions are powerful. And what does the other side do all the time to get their points across? They use the most powerful emotion, fear. Fear is a powerful motivator. And, you know, if you just suggest like a trans person's going to do something horrible to someone in a bathroom, like, nobody wants to support something that might end up having that outcome. And so, you know, we need to be really careful and clever in how we can turn that around and maybe make the fear in the opposite direction, because they have really powerful fear motivation against the trans community. And that's really hard to overcome in a lot of people.
Arlie, I actually want to follow up with you on this because I'm really interested in your perspective on this, being the campaign strategist with the National Political Advocacy Department at the ACLU. So kind of piggybacking off of these questions, I guess we'll kind of put them together. What have you found to be the most effective means at a larger national scale to be able to change people's minds when they come from these kind of mentalities, and also to be able to mobilize your base to be able to engage in advocacy in the ways that we've been discussing?
Yeah, for sure. There's so much good conversation going on. It's exciting. But yeah, I think Riley, what you're saying, and the way you've brought together our social media world and our legislative advocacy world, it's like, I mean, we're nothing without each other, right? And, you know, there's that phrase of if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, doesn't make a sound, right? Like, if we pass a law in the legislature and no one's in the room and no one knows about it, does it matter? No, right? So I think, you know, as the ACLU and in concert with so many of your organizations and this LGBTQ advocacy work and world, our jobs are to get people involved and caring, and that is the work that makes the law pass and the law matter. You know, a lot of the work we do in the political advocacy department, and I think, you know, what all of you are doing every day is really, you know, bringing people up the ladder of engagement, as my amazing organizer friends have really taught me. How do we get someone to take a small action on it and show that they care about it? How do we get them to get a bigger action? How do we get them to host a thing? How do we get them to really be behind moving this forward? And in that process, changing hearts and minds and getting people to understand who we are. So yeah, I think, you know, that social media world is such a huge part of it. And I think a lot of our work is, I mean, you know, taking those data pieces, taking the stories and the personal connection, putting them all together and trying to influence people in the best ways we can to get involved, because that's the only way that we're really making a difference.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I think one of the most successful things I have ever seen as far as like getting people to stay involved long term, and it wasn't a massive group of people, it was like 4 or 5, but they stayed involved long term with multiple issues within this same district in California. And it was because they adopted this thing that was done by Hakeem Jeffries. It was called Congress on Your Corner, or Summer Sessions. It was literally, we would just show up. We wouldn't wear our ties or anything like that. jeans, t-shirt, whatever. And we'd hang out on the corner and we'd talk to people that lived in the district and just be like, hey, what's going on? What's affecting your lives these days? What's happening? And we do that every few weekends. And by doing that, we had the opportunity to follow up with some of the same people. And those people, came to us later and were just like, yeah, I never looked at politics as anything for me to be involved in. I just, as long as, I needed or had what I needed, I was happy. It didn't matter. I didn't think y'all cared, but you all are out here every week talking to us. And now we have a personal relationship and we talk. And that allowed that opportunity to share those stories and that data and all of these things that, we talk about that really drive, this action. And it was really cool to see it not just be like a one-time action, but people continuously be involved. And I think, just showing up and being out there, like as your everyday self, can go a really long way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. How about this? There's several questions, and this is a conversation that could go on very long. Thank you all again so much for being here. I think that we'll summarize some of the last questions I had into one to bring us it'll probably bring us up to an hour. So the last question I'll have is for both groups. What are the most common objections that you often face in the courses of your advocacy to LGBT identities, rights, and legislation? How have you overcome them? And have you found either more like approachable or more combative means for addressing those kinds of objections to be more persuasive? To bring in context, a lot of discussion online can tend to be very combative sometimes. And there's a reasonable discussion to be had about whether or not there's any merit to that. So I'm interested in perspectives from both sides about what strategies you think as far as maybe rhetoric for engaging with these subjects that you've encountered, what you find to be the most effective.
I think the biggest hurdle is ignorance and stereotypes. Like when you say like gay person, lesbian person, trans person, people have a mental image. And most of us even grew up with terrible ideas of what that was from popular media and stuff. And so that the best weapon we have against it is just breaking those stereotypes. And so often I'll just talk to someone and, either I give them a chance to say something horrible. Sometimes people turn up in my DMs and they say a load of slurs at me and call me a man or whatever. And then I just take it and just talk back to them and just keep going. And then 2 hours later, they're like, oh, I didn't realize that you're such a normal person, or I feel really guilty. And that's happened so many times. And it's not a nice experience necessarily. And if you're not ready for it, don't do it. But there are other ways to break people's preconceived ideas of what an LGBT person is, just by existing, just, by doing any kind of media stuff or just being seen can make a big difference, I think.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I do a lot, in my work. And what I've always set out to do is, when I was even running for election, I wasn't saying hey, I'm a trans person, I'm running for office. It was, what can I do for you? How can I do this work for you? How can I make your life better? It's all about you, 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 you. It's not about me. It's not about me breaking barriers, being a trailblazer. Sure, that's great. But what can I do for you? And, showing people that trans people aren't just looking for our rights. And, I'm not pushing my rights down someone else's throat. I don't run a lot of bills on LGBT stuff because I'm in the toughest district in Colorado and I win by the smallest margin of anybody who runs. I have to do the work of the people in my district. And then I also do advocacy work on the side. So I have two jobs here. The representative in District 27, and then the visible advocate who shows up to all the events and does all that stuff. But it's separate. I keep it separate because it's important that, the people that I work for and in my political sphere understand that I'm just a trans person who works hard for the people in my community. And I'm really trying to work on my colleagues who, say all sorts of dumb stuff on the microphone from time to time. I have lunch with them. I run bills with them, even if they're the most horrible things. I still sponsor bills with them because I need to rise above it and say, look, you know what? Eventually, people are just going to say, oh, yeah, Brianna Tatone, the state rep in Colorado, not necessarily the trans person. And I told the media don't like highlight that unless it's relevant to the story. I'm a representative in Colorado. I do the work. I make laws here. And then I also, Pride Month, I mentioned that I'm trans a lot, but it's separating that. New York Times, they did an article about my bill composting people. They never mentioned once that I was a trans person. Thank you for doing that, really. I mean, I love that when people know that I'm a trans person and I'm in politics and I'm doing this work. And I love that for the people who care about it. But it's also, separating that. And it's hard because I want people to know who I am. I want people to be inspired, but I don't want to be pigeonholed into, oh, you're the trans politician. I'm just doing the work. And that's what's important. And I think that when more people do that, when there's doctors and teachers and everybody else doing that, that's what really shows people like, your argument about trans people is totally wrong. We're just people doing the work in the community.
I remember 2 years ago, it was in 2019, and I went with the mayor of College Park, Patrick Wilhan, the city's first gay mayor, to a community meeting in Prince George's County. It was right after 2 trans people of color were executed in Prince George's County. And it was a big event for LGBT people. It was like, obviously, it was a terrible thing that happened. It happened. There was all these meetings. Stuff's going to happen. Things are going to change. We're going to act. We're going to work together. A few months later, it was like it never happened. Everyone forgot. The community did not turn out like we needed it to turn out. And so while Pride Month came along, we saw the rainbow colors, we saw the flags, we still saw the people in our community like dying. And so when I saw like a bunch of queer people coming together to help distribute vaccines with the National Guard, to help distribute free healthcare products and toiletries to people, I knew that representation later, those people who are getting these free products are going to look back in the future and be like, hey, those people who are getting hurt right now, those are the same people who helped me. That person, that's a human being who gave me a vaccine. That's a human being who gave me free toiletries when I was in a place where I couldn't even afford those. I am going to make sure that I stand with those interests because they were there for me. I'm going to be there for them. And I think that type of representation and making sure that we are trans people, we are gay people, we're bi people, we're non-binary people, and we are part of the community, and the community should stick together. I think that positive representation is so important to get people on our side.
I think that's exactly right. And Riley, back to kind of what you were asking about as well. I think part of our job in showing that representation, just being in office, being in jobs, being in the media, we are fighting some of that messaging from the other side and some of those little sound bites that they have, right? Boys shouldn't play on the girls' team, and that's not what we're talking about, folks, right? So like we need to do that work to say, these are trans girls, these are who's playing on teams, these are non-binary people, these are intersex people, like just like you said, being ourselves, not falling into the traps of our opposition, who has unfortunately some good social media folks too. But I think through our personalities, through our stories, through our data, through the work that we do, we can overcome their harmful and uninformed sound bites, dare I say. So it's great work, and great to be on a call with all of you who are really doing all that work in so many different ways.
Yeah, thank you. I think actually, to summarize, because we are coming up on an hour, so let me say again, thank you all so much for being here. I will respect all of your time. Just to emphasize the point, I don't know how many people are watching on other people. We have several other people who do social media on here, who may or may not be streaming right now. I have at least 500 people who are watching right now. And it's really cool to think that there's at minimum 500 people who have been able to take a lot away from this conversation. And who hopefully can be able to do a lot better legislative advocacy on their own, and using social media. So yeah, it's just really cool. I've really enjoyed this conversation. If everyone wants to say goodbye and shout out who they are and just kind of give like an outro or whatever you want to do, then you are more than welcome. But we'll wrap up the panel. So thank you all so much.
Thank
Hey,
you,
everybody.
Riley.
Thanks.
I'm Brianna Tone, Brianna for CO on Twitter, Brianna for Colorado, Instagram, and Facebook. And eventually I'm gonna get on Twitter. It's my goal.
Don't do it. It's horrible.
I mean, no. I mean not Twitter. TikTok.
Oh.
That's-
Yeah.
I'm committed to get on TikTok.
It is. Yeah. No, it's
Already
actually
on Twitter.
randomly last night I posted a video there. It's already got like I think about 5,000 views from posting at like midnight last night. Like TikTok is weird and very different from YouTube, but I am figuring it out.
Let's talk. I need help.
Well, certainly. Well, hey, talk to me if you ever need any help. Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
One quick shout out I want to give. Tomorrow I will be at the Pride Month Drag Brunch fundraiser, which is helping raise money for an amazing LGBTQ plus candidate in Annapolis, Keanu Smith Brown. So if anybody out there is in the Maryland area and would like to go out there and help raise money for an amazing LGBTQ plus candidate, I would love to see you there.
All right. Thank you so much, Dylan. Katie, Destiny, Grayson.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was really fun to be on here. I'm Katie Montgomery. If you want to see a dickhead arguing on the internet, come to Twitter and watch me in action. And if you like death metal, check out my band. And happy Pride Month. Yay.
Yeah, happy Pride Month.
I'm Stephen Bonnell. People know me online as Destiny. Thanks for inviting me. It was a fun chat.
Remember to hit that like and subscribe, and don't forget the notification bell so that my videos show up right in your feed.
Oh, I'm getting epic gear now, dude. That shit cray. Look at that.